PCI DSS 12. Requirements. 1. Install and maintain a firewall configuration to protect cardholder data. Firewalls are devices that control computer traffic allowed between an entity's internal and untrusted networks, external, as well as traffic into and out of more sensitive areas within an entity's internal trusted networks. The cardholder data environment is an example of a more sensitive area within an entity's trusted network. A firewall examines all network traffic and blocks those transmissions that do not meet the specified security criteria. All systems must be protected from unauthorized access from untrusted networks, whether entering the system via the Internet as e-commerce, employee Internet access through desktop browsers, employee email access, dedicated connections such as business-to-business connections, via wireless networks, or via other sources. Often, seemingly insignificant paths to and from untrusted networks can provide unprotected pathways into key systems. Firewalls are a key protection mechanism for any computer network. Other system components may provide firewall functionality, as long as they meet the minimum requirements for firewalls as defined in Requirement 1. Where other system components are used within the cardholder data environment to provide firewall functionality, these devices must be included within the scope and assessment of Requirement 1. Firewalls and routers are key components of the architecture that controls entry to and exit from the network. These devices are software or hardware devices that block unwanted access and manage authorized access into and out of the network. Configuration standards and procedures will help to ensure that the organization's first line of defense in the protection of its data remains strong. A documented and implemented process for approving and testing all connections and changes to the firewalls and routers will help prevent security problems caused by misconfiguration of the network, router, or firewall. Without formal approval and testing of changes, records of the changes might not be updated, which could lead to inconsistencies between network documentation and the actual configuration. Network diagrams describe how networks are configured and identify the location of all network devices. Without current network diagrams, devices could be overlooked and be unknowingly left out of the security controls implemented for PCI DSS and thus be vulnerable to compromise. Cardholder data flow diagrams identify the location of all cardholder data that is stored, processed, or transmitted within the network. Network and cardholder data flow diagrams help an organization to understand and keep track of the scope of their environment by showing how cardholder data flows across networks and between individual systems and devices. Using a firewall on every internet connection coming into and out of the network and between any DMZ and the internal network allows the organization to monitor and control access and minimizes the chances of a malicious individual obtaining access to the internal network via an unprotected connection. This description of roles and assignment of responsibilities ensures that personnel are aware of who is responsible for the security of all network components, and that those assigned to manage components are aware of their responsibilities. If roles and responsibilities are not formally assigned, devices could be left unmanaged. Compromises often happen due to unused or insecure service and ports, since these often have known vulnerabilities and many organizations don't patch vulnerabilities for the services, protocols, and ports they don't use, even though the vulnerabilities are still present. By clearly defining and documenting the services, protocols, and ports that are necessary for business, organizations can ensure that all other services, protocols, and ports are disabled or removed. Approvals should be granted by personnel independent of the personnel managing the configuration. If insecure services, protocols, or ports are necessary for business, the risk posed by use of these protocols should be clearly understood and accepted by the organization, the use of the protocols should be justified, and the security features that allow these protocols to be used securely should be documented and implemented. If these insecure services, protocols, or ports are not necessary for business, they should be disabled or removed. For guidance on services, protocols, or ports considered to be insecure, refer to industry standards and guidance, example, NIST, NISA, OWASP, etc. This review gives the organization an opportunity at least every 6 months to clean up any unneeded, outdated, or incorrect rules, and ensure that all rule sets allow only authorized services and ports that match the documented business justifications. Organizations with a high volume of changes to firewall and router rule sets may wish to consider performing reviews more frequently, to ensure that the rule sets continue to meet the needs of the business. It is essential to install network protection between the internal, trusted network and any untrusted network that is external and or out of the entity's ability to control or manage. Failure to implement this measure correctly results in the entity being vulnerable to unauthorized access by malicious individuals or software. For firewall functionality to be effective, it must be properly configured to control and/or limit traffic into and out of the entity's network. Examination of all inbound and outbound connections allows for inspection and restriction of traffic based on the source and/or destination address, thus preventing unfiltered access between untrusted and trusted environments. This prevents malicious individuals from accessing the entity's network via unauthorized IP addresses or from using services, protocols, or ports in an unauthorized manner, for example, to send data they've obtained from within the entity's network out to an untrusted server. Implementing a rule that denies all inbound and outbound traffic that is not specifically needed helps to prevent inadvertent holes that would allow unintended and potentially harmful traffic in or out. While the running, or active, router configuration files include the current, secure settings, the start/up files, which are used when routers are restarted or booted, must be updated with the same secure settings to ensure these settings are applied when the startup configuration is run. Because they only run occasionally, startup configuration files are often forgotten and are not updated. When a router restarts and loads a startup configuration that has not been updated with the same secure settings as those in the running configuration, it may result in weaker rules that allow malicious individuals into the network. The known, or unknown, implementation and exploitation of wireless technology within a network is a common path for malicious individuals to gain access to the network and cardholder data. If a wireless device or network is installed without the entity's knowledge, a malicious individual could easily and invisibly enter the network. If firewalls do not restrict access from wireless networks into the CD, malicious individuals that gain unauthorized access to the wireless network can easily connect to the CD and compromise account information. Firewalls must be installed between all wireless networks and the CD, regardless of the purpose of the environment to which the wireless network is connected. This may include, but is not limited to, corporate networks, retail stores, guest networks, warehouse environments, etc. While there may be legitimate reasons for untrusted connections to be permitted to DMZ systems, example, to allow public access to a web server, such connections should never be granted to systems in the internal network. A firewall's intent is to manage and control all connections between public systems and internal systems, especially those that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. If direct access is allowed between public systems and the CD, the protections offered by the firewall are bypassed, and system components storing cardholder data may be exposed to compromise. The DMZ is that part of the network that manages connections between the Internet, or other untrusted networks, and services that an organization needs to have available to the public, like a web server. This functionality is intended to prevent malicious individuals from accessing the organization's internal network from the Internet, or from using services, protocols, or ports in an unauthorized manner. Normally, a packet contains the IP address of the computer that originally sent it, so other computers in the network know where the packet came from. Malicious individuals will often try to spoof, or imitate, the sending IP address so that the target system believes the packet is from a trusted source. Filtering packets coming into the network helps to, among other things, ensure packets are not spoofed, to look like they are coming from an organization's own internal network. All traffic outbound from the cardholder data environment should be evaluated to ensure that it follows established, authorized rules. Connections should be inspected to restrict traffic to only authorized communications, for example by restricting source destination addresses ports, and/or blocking of content. A firewall that maintains the state, or the status, for each connection through the firewall knows whether an apparent response to a previous connection is actually a valid, authorized response, since it retains each connection status, or is malicious traffic trying to trick the firewall into allowing the connection. If cardholder data is located within the DMZ, it is easier for an external attacker to access this information, since there are fewer layers to penetrate. Securing system components that store cardholder data in an internal network zone that is segregated from the DMZ and other untrusted networks by a firewall can prevent unauthorized network traffic from reaching the system component. Note: this requirement is not intended to apply to temporary storage of cardholder data in volatile memory. Restricting the disclosure of internal or private IP addresses is essential to prevent a hacker learning the IP addresses of the internal network and using that information to access the network. Methods used to meet the intent of this requirement may vary depending on the specific networking technology being used. For example, the controls used to meet this requirement may be different for IPv4 networks than for IPv6 networks. Portable computing devices that are allowed to connect to the Internet from outside the corporate firewall are more vulnerable to Internet-based threats. Use of firewall functionality, example, personal firewall software or hardware, helps to protect devices from Internet-based attacks, which could use the device to gain access to the organization's systems and data once the device is reconnected to the network. The specific firewall configuration settings are determined by the organization. Note: this requirement applies to employee-owned and company-owned portable computing devices. Systems that cannot be managed by corporate policy introduce weaknesses and provide opportunities that malicious individuals may exploit. Allowing untrusted systems to connect to an organization's CDE could result in access being granted to attackers and other malicious users. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures to ensure firewalls and routers are continuously managed to prevent unauthorized access to the network. Requirement 2. Do not use vendor-supplied defaults for system passwords and other security parameters. Malicious individuals, external and internal to an organization, often use vendor default settings, account names, and passwords to compromise operating system software, applications, and the systems on which they are installed. Because these default settings are often published and are well known in hacker communities, changing these settings will leave systems less vulnerable to attack. Even if a default account is not intended to be used, changing the default password to a strong unique password and then disabling the account will prevent a malicious individual from re-enabling the account and gaining access with the default password. If wireless networks are not implemented with sufficient security configurations, including changing default settings, wireless sniffers can eavesdrop on the traffic, easily capture data and passwords, and easily enter and attack the network. In addition, the key exchange protocol for older versions of 802.11x encryption, Wired Equivalent Privacy, or WP, has been broken and can render the encryption useless. Firmware for devices should be updated to support more secure protocols. There are known weaknesses with many operating systems, databases, and enterprise applications, and there are also known ways to configure these systems to fix security vulnerabilities. To help those that are not security experts, a number of security organizations have established system hardening guidelines and recommendations, which advise how to correct these weaknesses. Examples of sources for guidance on configuration standards include, but are not limited to, and product vendors. System configuration standards must be kept up to date to ensure that newly identified weaknesses are corrected prior to a system being installed on the network. If server functions that need different security levels are located on the same server, the security level of the functions with higher security needs would be reduced due to the presence of the lower security functions. Additionally, the server functions with a lower security level may introduce security weaknesses to other functions on the same server. By considering the security needs of different server functions as part of the system configuration standards and related processes, organizations can ensure that functions requiring different security levels don't coexist on the same server. As stated in Requirement 1.1.6, there are many protocols that a business may need, or have enabled by default, that are commonly used by malicious individuals to compromise a network. Including this requirement as part of an organization's configuration standards and related processes ensures that only the necessary services and protocols are enabled. Enabling security features before new servers are deployed will prevent servers being installed into the environment with insecure configurations. Ensuring that all insecure services, protocols, and daemons are adequately secured with appropriate security features makes it more difficult for malicious individuals to take advantage of commonly used points of compromise within a network. Refer to industry standards and best practices for information on strong cryptography and secure protocols, example, NIST SP 800-52 and SP 800-57, OWASP, etc. Note: SSL early TLS is not considered strong cryptography and may not be used as a security control, except by POS/POI terminals that are verified as not being susceptible to known exploits and the termination points to which they connect as defined in Appendix A2. System configuration standards and related processes should specifically address security settings and parameters that have known security implications for each type of system in use. In order for systems to be configured securely, personnel responsible for configuration and/or administering systems must be knowledgeable in the specific security parameters and settings that apply to the system. Unnecessary functions can provide additional opportunities for malicious individuals to gain access to a system. By removing unnecessary functionality, organizations can focus on securing the functions that are required and reduce the risk that unknown functions will be exploited. Including this in server hardening standards and processes addresses the specific security implications associated with unnecessary functions, for example, by removing disabling FTP or the web server if the server will not be performing those functions. If non-console, including remote, administration does not use secure authentication and encrypted communications, sensitive administrative or operational level information, like administrators' IDs and passwords, can be revealed to an eavesdropper. A malicious individual could use this information to access the network, become administrator, and steal data. Clear text protocols, such as HTTP, Telnet, etc., do not encrypt traffic or logon details, making it easy for an eavesdropper to intercept this information. To be considered: strong cryptography. Industry-recognized protocols with appropriate key strengths and key management should be in place as applicable for the type of technology in use. Refer to strong cryptography in the PCI DSS and PCI DSS glossary of terms, abbreviations, and acronyms, and industry standards and best practices such as NIST SP 800-52 and SP 800-57, OWASP, etc. Note: SSL early TLS is not considered strong cryptography and may not be used as a security control, except by POS/POI terminals that are verified as not being susceptible to known exploits, and the termination points to which they connect as defined in Appendix A2. Maintaining a current list of all system components will enable an organization to accurately and efficiently define the scope of their environment for implementing PCI DSS controls. Without an inventory, some system components could be forgotten and be inadvertently excluded from the organization's configuration standards. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and daily operational procedures to ensure vendor defaults and other security parameters are continuously managed to prevent insecure configurations. This is intended for hosting providers that provide shared hosting environments for multiple clients on the same server. When all data is on the same server and under control of a single environment, often the settings on these shared servers are not manageable by individual clients. This allows clients to add insecure functions and scripts that impact the security of all other client environments, and thereby make it easy for a malicious individual to compromise one client's data and thereby gain access to all other clients' data. See Appendix A1 for details of requirements. Requirement 3. Protect stored cardholder data. Protection methods such as encryption, truncation, masking, and hashing are critical components of cardholder data protection. If an intruder circumvents other security controls and gains access to encrypted data, without the proper cryptographic keys, the data is unreadable and unusable to that person. Other effective methods of protecting stored data should also be considered as potential risk mitigation opportunities. For example, methods for minimizing risk include not storing cardholder data unless absolutely necessary, truncating cardholder data if full PAN is not needed, and not sending unprotected PANs using end-user messaging technologies, such as email and instant messaging. Please refer to the PCI DSS and PCI DSS glossary of terms, abbreviations, and acronyms for definitions of strong cryptography and other PCI DSS terms. A formal data retention policy identifies what data needs to be retained, and where that data resides so it can be securely destroyed or deleted as soon as it is no longer needed. The only cardholder data that may be stored after authorization is the primary account number or PAN, rendered unreadable, expiration date, cardholder name, and service code. Understanding where cardholder data is located is necessary so it can be properly retained or disposed of when no longer needed. In order to define appropriate retention requirements, an entity first needs to understand their own business needs as well as any legal or regulatory obligations that apply to their industry, and/or that apply to the type of data being retained. Identifying and deleting stored data that has exceeded its specified retention period prevents unnecessary retention of data that is no longer needed. This process may be automated or manual, or a combination of both. For example, a programmatic procedure, automatic or manual, to locate and remove data and/or a manual review of data storage areas could be performed. Implementing secure deletion methods ensure that the data cannot be retrieved when it is no longer needed. Remember, if you don't need it, don't store it. Sensitive authentication data consists of full track data, card validation code or value, and PIN data. Storage of sensitive authentication data after authorization is prohibited. This data is very valuable to malicious individuals as it allows them to generate counterfeit payment cards and create fraudulent transactions. Entities that issue payment cards or that perform or support issuing services will often create and controls sensitive authentication data as part of the issuing function. It is allowable for companies that perform, facilitate, or support issuing services to store sensitive authentication data only if they have a legitimate business need to store such data. It should be noted that all PCI DSS requirements apply to issuers, and the only exception for issuers and issuer processors is that sensitive authentication data may be retained if there is a legitimate reason to do so. A legitimate reason is one that is necessary for the performance of the function being provided for the issuer and not one of convenience. Any such data must be stored securely and in accordance with all PCI DSS and specific payment brand requirements. For non-issuing entities, retaining sensitive authentication data post-authorization is not permitted. If full track data is stored, malicious individuals who obtain that data can use it to reproduce payment cards and complete fraudulent transactions. The purpose of the card validation code is to protect card not present transactions, internet or mail order telephone order, MO2, transactions, where the consumer and the card are not present. If this data is stolen, malicious individuals can execute fraudulent internet and MO2 transactions. These values should be known only to the card owner or bank that issued the card. If this data is stolen, malicious individuals can execute fraudulent PIN-based debit transactions, for example, ATM withdrawals. The display of full PIN on items such as computer screens, payment card receipts, faxes, or paper reports can result in this data being obtained by unauthorized individuals and used fraudulently. Ensuring that full PIN is only displayed for those with a legitimate business need to see the full PIN minimizes the risk of unauthorized persons gaining access to PIN data. The masking approach should always ensure that only the minimum number of digits is displayed as necessary to perform a specific business function. For example, if only the last 4 digits are needed to perform a business function, mask the PIN so that individuals performing that function can view only the last 4 digits. As another example, if a function needs access to the bank identification number, BIN, for routing purposes, unmask only the BIN digits, traditionally the first 6 digits, during that function. This requirement relates to protection of PIN displayed on screens, paper receipts, printouts, etc., and is not to be confused with requirement 3.4 for protection of PIN when stored in files, databases, etc. PIN stored in primary storage, databases, or flat files such as text files, spreadsheets, as well as non-primary storage, backup, audit logs, exception or troubleshooting logs, must all be protected. One-way hash functions based on strong cryptography can be used to render cardholder data unreadable. Hash functions are appropriate when there is no need to retrieve the original number. One-way hashes are irreversible. It is recommended, but not currently a requirement, that an additional, random input value be added to the cardholder data prior to hashing to reduce the feasibility of an attacker comparing the data against, and deriving the PIN from, tables of pre-computed hash values. The intent of truncation is to permanently remove a segment of PIN data so that only a portion, generally not to exceed the first 6 and last 4 digits, of the PIN is stored. An index token is a cryptographic token that replaces the PIN based on a given index for an unpredictable value. A one-time pad is a system in which a randomly generated private key is used only once to encrypt a message that is then decrypted using a matching one-time pad and key. The intent of strong cryptography, as defined in the PCI DSS and PCI DSS glossary of terms, abbreviations, and acronyms, is that the encryption be based on an industry-tested and accepted algorithm, not a proprietary or homegrown algorithm, with strong cryptographic keys. By correlating hashed and truncated versions of a given PIN, a malicious individual may easily derive the original PIN value. Controls that prevent the correlation of this data will help ensure that the original PIN remains unreadable. The intent of this requirement is to address the acceptability of disk-level encryption for rendering cardholder data unreadable. Disk-level encryption encrypts the entire disk partition on a computer and automatically decrypts the information when an authorized user requests it. Many disk encryption solutions intercept operating system read-write operations and carry out the appropriate cryptographic transformations without any special action by the user other than supplying a password or passphrase upon system startup, or at the beginning of a session. Based on these characteristics of disk-level encryption, to be compliant with this requirement, the method cannot 1. Use the same user account authenticator as the operating system, or 2. Use a decryption key that is associated with or derived from the system's local user account database or general network login credentials. Full disk encryption helps to protect data in the event of physical loss of a disk, and therefore may be appropriate for portable devices that store cardholder data. Cryptographic keys must be strongly protected because those who obtain access will be able to decrypt data. Key encrypting keys, if used, must be at least as strong as the data encrypting key in order to ensure proper protection of the key that encrypts the data as well as the data encrypted with that key. The requirement to protect keys from disclosure and misuse applies to both data encrypting keys and key encrypting keys. Because one key encrypting key may grant access to many data encrypting keys, the key encrypting keys require strong protection measures. Note: this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. Maintaining current documentation of the cryptographic architecture enables an entity to understand the algorithms, protocols, and cryptographic keys used to protect cardholder data, as well as the devices that generate, use, and protect the keys. This allows an entity to keep pace with evolving threats to their architecture, enabling them to plan for updates as the assurance levels provided by different algorithms' key strengths changes. Maintaining such documentation also allows an entity to detect lost or missing keys or key management devices, and identify unauthorized additions to their cryptographic architecture. There should be very few who have access to cryptographic keys, reducing the potential for rendering cardholder data visible by unauthorized parties, usually only those who have key custodian responsibilities. Cryptographic keys must be stored securely to prevent unauthorized or unnecessary access that could result in the exposure of cardholder data. It is not intended that the key encrypting keys be encrypted, however, they are to be protected against disclosure and misuse as defined in Requirement 3.5. If key encrypting keys are used, storing the key encrypting keys in physically and/or logically separate locations from the data encrypting keys reduces the risk of unauthorized access to both keys. Storing cryptographic keys in the fewest locations helps an organization to keep track and monitor all key locations, and minimizes the potential for keys to be exposed to unauthorized parties. The manner in which cryptographic keys are managed is a critical part of the continued security of the encryption solution. A good key management process, whether it is manual or automated as part of the encryption product, is based on industry standards and addresses all key elements at 3.6.1 through 3.6.8. Providing guidance to customers on how to securely transmit, store, and update cryptographic keys can help prevent keys from being mismanaged or disclosed to unauthorized entities. This requirement applies to keys used to encrypt stored cardholder data, and any respective key encrypting keys. Note: Testing Procedure 3.6. is an additional procedure that only applies if the entity being assessed is a service provider. The encryption solution must generate strong keys, as defined in the PCI DSS and PCI DSS glossary of terms, abbreviations, and acronyms under cryptographic key generation. Use of strong cryptographic keys significantly increases the level of security of encrypted cardholder data. The encryption solution must distribute keys securely, meaning the keys are distributed only to custodians identified in Requirement 3.5.2 and are never distributed in the clear. The encryption solution must store keys securely, for example, by encrypting them with a key encrypting key. Storing keys without proper protection could provide access to attackers, resulting in the decryption and exposure of cardholder data. A crypt period is the time span during which a particular cryptographic key can be used for its defined purpose. Considerations for defining the crypt period include, but are not limited to, the strength of the underlying algorithm, size or length of the key, risk of key compromise, and the sensitivity of the data being encrypted. Periodic changing of encryption keys when the keys have reached the end of their crypt period is imperative to minimize the risk of someone's obtaining the encryption keys and using them to decrypt data. Keys that are no longer used or needed, or keys that are known or suspected to be compromised, should be revoked and/or destroyed to ensure that the keys can no longer be used. If such keys need to be kept, for example, to support archived, encrypted data, they should be strongly protected. The encryption solution should provide for and facilitate a process to replace keys that are due for replacement, or that are known to be, or suspected of being, compromised. Split knowledge and dual control of keys are used to eliminate the possibility of one person having access to the whole key. This control is applicable for manual key management operations, or where key management is not implemented by the encryption product. Split knowledge is a method in which two or more people separately have key components, where each person knows only their own key component, and the individual key components convey no knowledge of the original cryptographic key. Dual control requires two or more people to perform a function, and no single person can access or use the authentication materials of another. The encryption solution should not allow for or accept substitution of keys coming from unauthorized sources or unexpected processes. This process will help ensure individuals that act as key custodians commit to the key custodian role and understand and accept the responsibilities. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and documented operational procedures for managing the secure storage of cardholder data on a continuous basis. Requirement 4. Encrypt transmission of cardholder data across open, public networks. Sensitive information must be encrypted during transmission over networks that are easily accessed by malicious individuals. Misconfigured wireless networks and vulnerabilities in legacy encryption and authentication protocols continue to be targets of malicious individuals who exploit these vulnerabilities to gain privileged access to cardholder data environments. Sensitive information must be encrypted during transmission over public networks, because it is easy and common for a malicious individual to intercept and/or divert data while in transit. Secure transmission of cardholder data requires using trusted keys certificates, a secure protocol for transport, and proper encryption strength to encrypt cardholder data. Connection requests from systems that do not support the required encryption strength, and that would result in an insecure connection, should not be accepted. Note that some protocol implementations, such as SSL, SSH version 1.0, and early TLS, have known vulnerabilities that an attacker can use to gain control of the affected system. Whichever security protocol is used, ensure it is configured to use only secure versions and configurations to prevent use of an insecure connection, for example, by using only trusted certificates and supporting only strong encryption, not supporting weaker, insecure protocols or methods. Verifying that certificates are trusted, for example, have not expired and are issued from a trusted source, helps ensure the integrity of the secure connection. Generally, the web page URL should begin with HTTPS. And/or the web browser display a padlock icon somewhere in the window of the browser. Many TLS certificate vendors also provide a highly visible verification seal, sometimes referred to as a security seal, secure site seal, or secure trust seal, which may provide the ability to click on the seal to reveal information about the website. Refer to industry standards and best practices for information on strong cryptography and secure protocols, example, NIST SP 800-52 and SP 800-57, OWASP, etc. Note, SSL early TLS is not considered strong cryptography and may not be used as a security control, except by POS/POI terminals that are verified as not being susceptible to known exploits, and the termination points to which they connect as defined in Appendix A2. Malicious users use free and widely available tools to eavesdrop on wireless communications. Use of strong cryptography can help limit disclosure of sensitive information across wireless networks. Strong cryptography for authentication and transmission of cardholder data is required to prevent malicious users from gaining access to the wireless network or utilizing wireless networks to access other internal networks or data. Email, instant messaging, SMS, and chat can be easily intercepted by packet sniffing during delivery across internal and public networks. Do not utilize these messaging tools to send PAN unless they are configured to provide strong encryption. Additionally, if an entity requests PAN via end-user messaging technologies, the entity should provide a tool or method to protect these PANs using strong cryptography or render PANs unreadable before transmission. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures for managing the secure transmission of cardholder data on a continuous basis. Requirement 5. Protect all systems against malware and regularly update antivirus software or programs. Malicious software, commonly referred to as malware, including viruses, worms, and trojans, enters the network during many business-approved activities including employee email and use of the internet, mobile computers, and storage devices, resulting in the exploitation of system vulnerabilities. Antivirus software must be used on all systems commonly affected by malware to protect systems from current and evolving malicious software threats. Additional anti-malware solutions may be considered as a supplement to the antivirus software. However, such additional solutions do not replace the need for antivirus software to be in place. There is a constant stream of attacks using widely published exploits, often called zero-day, an attack that exploits a previously unknown vulnerability against otherwise secured systems. Without an antivirus solution that is updated regularly, these new forms of malicious software can attack systems, disable a network, or lead to compromise of data. It is important to protect against all types and forms of malicious software. Typically, mainframes, mid-range computers, such as AS400, and similar systems may not currently be commonly targeted or affected by malware. However, industry trends for malicious software can change quickly, so it is important for organizations to be aware of new malware that might affect their systems, for example, by monitoring vendor security notices and antivirus news groups to determine whether their systems might be coming under threat from new and evolving malware. Trends in malicious software should be included in the identification of new security vulnerabilities, and methods to address new trends should be incorporated into the company's configuration standards and protection mechanisms as needed. Even the best antivirus solutions are limited in effectiveness if they are not maintained and kept current with the latest security updates, signature files, or malware protections. Audit logs provide the ability to monitor virus and malware activity and anti-malware reactions. Thus, it is imperative that anti-malware solutions be configured to generate audit logs and that these logs be managed in accordance with Requirement 10. Antivirus that continually runs and is unable to be altered will provide persistent security against malware. Use of policy-based controls on all systems to ensure anti-malware protections cannot be altered or disabled will help prevent system weaknesses from being exploited by malicious software. Additional security measures may also need to be implemented for the period of time during which antivirus protection is not active, for example, disconnecting the unprotected system from the Internet while the antivirus protection is disabled, and running a full scan after it is re-enabled. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures to ensure systems are protected from malware on a continuous basis. Requirement 6. Develop and maintain secure systems and applications. Unscrupulous individuals use security vulnerabilities to gain privileged access to systems. Many of these vulnerabilities are fixed by vendor-provided security patches, which must be installed by the entities that manage the systems. All systems must have all appropriate software patches to protect against the exploitation and compromise of cardholder data by malicious individuals and malicious software. Note: appropriate software patches are those patches that have been evaluated and tested sufficiently to determine that the patches do not conflict with existing security configurations. For in-house developed applications, numerous vulnerabilities can be avoided by using standard system development processes and secure coding techniques. The intent of this requirement is that organizations keep up to date with new vulnerabilities that may impact their environment. Sources for vulnerability information should be trustworthy and often include vendor websites, industry news groups, mailing lists, or RSS feeds. Once an organization identifies a vulnerability that could affect their environment, the risk that the vulnerability poses must be evaluated and ranked. The organization must therefore have a method in place to evaluate vulnerabilities on an ongoing basis and assign risk rankings to those vulnerabilities. This is not achieved by an ASV scan or internal vulnerability scan. Rather, this requires a process to actively monitor industry sources for vulnerability information. Classifying the risks, for example, as high, medium, or low, allows organizations to identify, prioritize, and address the highest risk items more quickly and reduce the likelihood that vulnerabilities posing the greatest risk will be exploited. There is a constant stream of attacks using widely published exploits, often called zero-day, an attack that exploits a previously unknown vulnerability against otherwise secured systems. If the most recent patches are not implemented on critical systems as soon as possible, a malicious individual can use these exploits to attack or disable a system, or gain access to sensitive data. Prioritizing patches for critical infrastructure ensure that high-priority systems and devices are protected from vulnerabilities as soon as possible after a patch is released. Consider prioritizing patch installations such that security patches for critical or at-risk systems are installed within 30 days, and other lower-risk patches are installed within 2 to 3 months. This requirement applies to applicable patches for all installed software, including payment applications, both those that are PCI DSS validated and those that are not. Without the inclusion of security during the requirement's definition, design, analysis, and testing phases of software development, security vulnerabilities can be inadvertently or maliciously introduced into the production environment. Understanding how sensitive data is handled by the application, including when stored, transmitted, and when in memory, can help identify where data needs to be protected. Development, test, and/or custom application accounts, user IDs, and passwords should be removed from production code before the application becomes active or is released to customers, since these items may give away information about the functioning of the application. Possession of such information could facilitate compromise of the application and related cardholder data. Security vulnerabilities in custom code are commonly exploited by malicious individuals to gain access to a network and compromise cardholder data. An individual knowledgeable and experienced in code review techniques should be involved in the review process. Code reviews should be performed by someone other than the developer of the code to allow for an independent, objective review. Automated tools or processes may also be used in lieu of manual reviews, but keep in mind that it may be difficult or even impossible for an automated tool to identify some coding issues. Correcting coding errors before the code is deployed into a production environment or released to customers prevents the code exposing the environments to potential exploit. Faulty code is also far more difficult and expensive to address after it has been deployed or released into production environments. Including a formal review and sign-off by management prior to release helps to ensure that code is approved and has been developed in accordance with policies and procedures. Without properly documented and implemented change controls, security features could be inadvertently or deliberately omitted or rendered inoperable, processing irregularities could occur, or malicious code could be introduced. Due to the constantly changing state of development and test environments, they tend to be less secure than the production environment. Without adequate separation between environments, it may be possible for the production environment and cardholder data to be compromised due to less stringent security configurations and possible vulnerabilities in a test or development environment. Reducing the number of personnel with access to the production environment and cardholder data minimizes risk and helps ensure that access is limited to those individuals with a business need to know. The intent of this requirement is to separate development and test functions from production functions. For example, a developer may use an administrator-level account with elevated privileges in the development environment, and have a separate account with user-level access to the production environment. Security controls are usually not as stringent in test or development environments. Use of production data provides malicious individuals with the opportunity to gain unauthorized access to production data, cardholder data. Test data and accounts should be removed before the system component becomes active in production, since these items may give away information about the functioning of the application or system. Possession of such information could facilitate compromise of the system and related cardholder data. If not properly managed, the impact of system changes, such as hardware or software updates and installation of security patches, might not be fully realized and could have unintended consequences. The impact of the change should be documented so that all affected parties can plan appropriately for any processing changes. Approval by authorized parties indicates that the change is a legitimate and approved change sanctioned by the organization. Thorough testing should be performed to verify that the security of the environment is not reduced by implementing a change. Testing should validate that all existing security controls remain in place, are replaced with equally strong controls, or are strengthened after any change to the environment. For each change, there should be documented backout procedures in case the change fails or adversely affects the security of an application or system, to allow the system to be restored back to its previous state. Having processes to analyze significant changes helps ensure that all appropriate PCI DSS controls are applied to any systems or networks added or changed within the in-scope environment. Building this validation into change management processes helps ensure that device inventories and configuration standards are kept up to date, and security controls are applied where needed. A change management process should include supporting evidence that PCI DSS requirements are implemented or preserved through the iterative process. Examples of PCI DSS requirements that could be impacted include, but are not limited to: network diagram is updated to reflect changes. Systems are configured per configuration standards, with all default passwords changed and unnecessary services disabled. Systems are protected with required controls, example, file integrity monitoring, FIM, antivirus, patches, audit logging. Sensitive authentication data, SAD, is not stored and all cardholder data, CHD, storage is documented and incorporated into data retention policy and procedures. New systems are included in the quarterly vulnerability scanning process. The application layer is high risk and may be targeted by both internal and external threats. Requirements 6.5.1 through June 5, 10 are the minimum controls that should be in place, and organizations should incorporate the relevant secure coding practices as applicable to the particular technology in their environment. Application developers should be properly trained to identify and resolve issues related to these and other common coding vulnerabilities. Having staff knowledgeable of secure coding guidelines should minimize the number of security vulnerabilities introduced through poor coding practices. Training for developers may be provided in-house or by third parties and should be applicable for technology used. As industry-accepted secure coding practices change, Organizational coding practices and developer training should likewise be updated to address new threats, for example, memory scraping attacks. The vulnerabilities identified in 6.5.1 through June 5, 10 provide a minimum baseline. It is up to the organization to remain up to date with vulnerability trends and incorporate appropriate measures into their secure coding practices. Injection flaws, particularly SQL injection, are a commonly used method for compromising applications. Injection occurs when user-supplied data is sent to an interpreter as part of a command or query. The attacker's hostile data tricks the interpreter into executing unintended commands or changing data, and allows the attacker to attack components inside the network through the application, to initiate attacks such as buffer overflows, or to reveal both confidential information and server application functionality. Information should be validated before being sent to the application, for example, by checking for all alpha characters, mix of alpha and numeric characters, etc. Buffer overflows occur when an application does not have appropriate bounds checking on its buffer space. This can cause the information in the buffer to be pushed out of the buffer's memory space and into executable memory space. When this occurs, the attacker has the ability to insert malicious code at the end of the buffer, and then push that malicious code into executable memory space by overflowing the buffer. The malicious code is then executed and often enables the attacker remote access to the application and/or infected system. Applications that do not utilize strong cryptographic functions properly to store data are at increased risk of being compromised and exposing authentication credentials and/or cardholder data. If an attacker is able to exploit weak cryptographic processes, they may be able to gain clear text access to encrypted data. Applications that fail to adequately encrypt network traffic using strong cryptography are at increased risk of being compromised and exposing cardholder data. If an attacker is able to exploit weak cryptographic processes, they may be able to gain control of an application, or even gain clear text access to encrypted data. Applications can unintentionally leak information about their configuration or internal workings, or expose privileged information through improper error handling methods. Attackers use this weakness to steal sensitive data or compromise the system altogether. If a malicious individual can create errors that the application does not handle properly, they can gain detailed system information, create denial of service interruptions, cause security to fail, or crash the server. For example, the message, "Incorrect password provided," tells an attacker the user ID provided was accurate and that they should focus their efforts only on the password. Use more generic error messages like, "Data could not be verified." All vulnerabilities identified by an organization's vulnerability risk ranking process, defined in Requirement 6.1, to be high risk, and that could affect the application should be identified and addressed during application development. Web applications, both internally and externally, public-facing, have unique security risks based upon their architecture as well as the relative ease and occurrence of compromise. XSS flaws occur whenever an application takes user-supplied data and sends it to a web browser without first validating or encoding that content. XSS allows attackers to execute script in the victim's browser, which can hijack user sessions, deface websites, possibly introduce worms, etc. A direct object reference occurs when a developer exposes a reference to an internal implementation object, such as a file, directory, database record, or key, as a URL or form parameter. Attackers can manipulate those references to access other objects without authorization. Consistently enforce access control in presentation layer and business logic for all URLs. Frequently, the only way an application protects sensitive functionality is by preventing the display of links or URLs to unauthorized users. Attackers can use this weakness to access and perform unauthorized operations by accessing those URLs directly. An attacker may be able to enumerate and navigate the directory structure of a website, directory traversal, thus gaining access to unauthorized information as well as gaining further insight into the workings of the site for later exploitation. If user interfaces permit access to unauthorized functions, this access could result in unauthorized individuals gaining access to privileged credentials or cardholder data. Only authorized users should be permitted to access direct object references to sensitive resources. Limiting access to data resources will help prevent cardholder data from being presented to unauthorized resources. A CSRF attack forces a logged-on victim's browser to send a pre-authenticated request to a vulnerable web application, which then enables the attacker to perform any state-changing operations the victim is authorized to perform, such as updating account details, making purchases, or even authenticating to the application. Secure authentication and session management prevents unauthorized individuals from compromising legitimate account credentials, keys, or session tokens that would otherwise enable the intruder to assume the identity of an authorized user. Public-facing web applications are primary targets for attackers, and poorly coded web applications provide an easy path for attackers to gain access to sensitive data and systems. The requirement for reviewing applications or installing web application firewalls is intended to reduce the number of compromises on public-facing web applications due to poor coding or application management practices. Manual or automated vulnerability security assessment tools or methods review and/or test the application for vulnerabilities. Web application firewalls filter and block non-essential traffic at the application layer. Used in conjunction with a network-based firewall, a properly configured web application firewall prevents application layer attacks if applications are improperly coded or configured. This can be achieved through a combination of technology and process. Process-based solutions must have mechanisms that facilitate timely responses to alerts in order to meet the intent of this requirement, which is to prevent attacks. Note: an organization that specializes in application security can be either a third-party company or an internal organization, as long as the reviewers specialize in application security and can demonstrate independence from the development team. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures to ensure systems and applications are securely developed and protected from vulnerabilities on a continuous basis. Requirement 7. Restrict access to cardholder data by business need to know. To ensure critical data can only be accessed by authorized personnel, systems and processes must be in place to limit access based on need to know and according to job responsibilities. Need to know is when access rights are granted to only the least amount of data and privileges needed to perform a job. The more people who have access to cardholder data, the more risk there is that a user's account will be used maliciously. Limiting access to those with a legitimate business reason for the access helps an organization prevent mishandling of cardholder data through inexperience or malice. In order to limit access to cardholder data to only those individuals who need such access, first it is necessary to define access needs for each role, for example, system administrator, call center personnel, store clerk, the system's devices data each role needs access to, and the level of privilege each role needs to effectively perform assigned tasks. Once roles and corresponding access needs are defined, individuals can be granted access accordingly. When assigning privilege IDs, it is important to assign individuals only the privileges they need to perform their job, the least privileges. For example, the database administrator or backup administrator should not be assigned the same privileges as the overall systems administrator. Assigning least privileges helps prevent users without sufficient knowledge about the application from incorrectly or accidentally changing application configuration or altering its security settings. Enforcing least privilege also helps to minimize the scope of damage if an unauthorized person gains access to a user ID. Once needs are defined for user roles, per PCI DSS Requirement 7.1.1, it is easy to grant individuals access according to their job classification and function by using the already created roles. Documented approval, for example, in writing or electronically, assures that those with access and privileges are known and authorized by management, and that their access is necessary for their job function. Without a mechanism to restrict access based on users' need to know, a user may unknowingly be granted access to cardholder data. Access control systems automate the process of restricting access and assigning privileges. Additionally, a default denial setting ensures no one is granted access until and unless a rule is established specifically granting such access. Entities may have one or more access control systems to manage user access. Note: some access control systems are set by default to allow all, thereby permitting access until a rule is written to specifically deny it. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures to ensure that access is controlled and based on need to know and least privilege, on a continuous basis. Requirement 8. Identify and authenticate access to system components. Assigning a unique identification, ID, to each person with access ensures that each individual is uniquely accountable for their actions. When such accountability is in place, actions taken on critical data and systems are performed by, and can be traced to, known and authorized users and processes. The effectiveness of a password is largely determined by the design and implementation of the authentication system, particularly how frequently password attempts can be made by an attacker, and the security methods to protect user passwords at the point of entry, during transmission, and while in storage. Note: these requirements are applicable for all accounts, including point-of-sale accounts, with administrative capabilities and all accounts used to view or access cardholder data or to access systems with cardholder data. This includes accounts used by vendors and other third parties, for example, for support or maintenance. These requirements do not apply to accounts used by consumers, example, cardholders. However, requirements 8.1.1, 8.2, 8.5, 8.2.3 through 8.2.5, and 8.1.6 through 8.1. 8 are not intended to apply to user accounts within a point-of-sale payment application that only have access to one card number at a time in order to facilitate a single transaction, such as cashier accounts. By ensuring each user is uniquely identified, instead of using one ID for several employees, an organization can maintain individual responsibility for actions and an effective audit trail per employee. This will help speed issue resolution and containment when misuse or malicious intent occurs. To ensure that user accounts granted access to systems are all valid and recognized users, strong processes must manage all changes to user IDs and other authentication credentials, including adding new ones and modifying or deleting existing ones. If an employee has left the company and still has access to the network via their user account, unnecessary or malicious access to cardholder data could occur, either by the former employee or by a malicious user who exploits the old and/or unused account. To prevent unauthorized access, user credentials and other authentication methods therefore need to be revoked promptly, as soon as possible, upon the employee's departure. Accounts that are not used regularly are often targets of attacks since it is less likely that any changes, such as a changed password, will be noticed. As such, these accounts may be more easily exploited and used to access cardholder data. Allowing vendors to have 24/7 access into your network in case they need to support your systems increases the chances of unauthorized access, either from a user in the vendor's environment, or from a malicious individual who finds and uses this always available external entry point into your network. Enabling access only for the time periods needed, and disabling it as soon as it is no longer needed, helps prevent misuse of these connections. Monitoring of vendor access provides assurance that vendors are accessing only the systems necessary, and only during approved time frames. Without account lockout mechanisms in place, an attacker can continually attempt to guess a password through manual or automated tools, for example, password cracking, until they achieve success and gain access to a user's account. Note: Testing Procedure 8.1.6.b is an additional procedure that only applies if the entity being assessed is a service provider. If an account is locked out due to someone continually trying to guess a password, controls to delay reactivation of these locked accounts stops the malicious individual from continually guessing the password. They will have to stop for a minimum of 30 minutes until the account is reactivated. Additionally, if reactivation must be requested, the admin or help desk can validate that it is the actual account owner requesting reactivation.
When users walk away from an open machine with access to critical system components or cardholder data, that machine may be used by others in the user's absence, resulting in unauthorized account access and/or misuse. The reauthentication can be applied either at the system level to protect all sessions running on that machine, or at the application level. These authentication methods, when used in addition to unique IDs, help protect users' IDs from being compromised, since the one attempting the compromise needs to know both the unique ID and the password, or another authentication used. Note that a digital certificate is a valid option for something you have as long as it is unique for a particular user. Since one of the first steps a malicious individual will take to compromise a system is to exploit weak or non-existent passwords, it is important to implement good processes for authentication management. Many network devices and applications transmit unencrypted, readable passwords across the network and/or store passwords without encryption. A malicious individual can easily intercept unencrypted passwords during transmission using a sniffer, or directly access unencrypted passwords in files where they are stored, and use this data to gain unauthorized access. Note: Testing Procedures 8.2.1.d and 8.2.1.e are additional procedures that only apply if the entity being assessed is a service provider. Many malicious individuals use social engineering, for example, calling a help desk and acting as a legitimate user, to have a password changed so they can utilize a user ID. Consider use of a secret question that only the proper user can answer to help administrators identify the user prior to resetting or modifying authentication credentials. Strong passwords passphrase are the first line of defense into a network, since a malicious individual will often first try to find accounts with weak or non-existent passwords. If passwords are short or simple to guess, it is relatively easy for a malicious individual to find these weak accounts and compromise a network under the guise of a valid user ID. This requirement specifies that a minimum of 7 characters and both numeric and alphabetic characters should be used for password's passphrase. For cases where this minimum cannot be met due to technical limitations, entities can use equivalent strength to evaluate their alternative. For information on variability and equivalency of password strength, also referred to as entropy, for passwords passphrase of different formats, refer to industry standards, e.g., the current version of NIST SP 800-63. Note, testing procedure 8.2.3.b is an additional procedure that only applies if the entity being assessed is a service provider. Passwords passphrase that are valid for a long time without a change provide malicious individuals with more time to work on breaking the password phrase. Note, testing procedure 8.2.4.b is an additional procedure that only applies if the entity being assessed is a service provider. If the same password is used for every new user, an internal user, former employee, or malicious individual may know or easily discover this password and use it to gain access to accounts. Multi-factor authentication requires an individual to present a minimum of 2 separate forms of authentication, as described in Requirement 8.2, before access is granted. Multi-factor authentication provides additional assurance that the individual attempting to gain access is who they claim to be. With multi-factor authentication, an attacker would need to compromise at least 2 different authentication mechanisms, increasing the difficulty of compromise and thus reducing the risk. Multi-factor authentication is not required at both the system level and application level for a particular system component. Multi-factor authentication can be performed either upon authentication to the particular network or to the system component. Examples of multi-factor technologies include but are not limited to remote authentication and dial-in service, RADIUS, with tokens, terminal access controller access control system, TACACS, with tokens, and other technologies that facilitate multi-factor authentication. This requirement is intended to apply to all personnel with administrative access to the CDE. This requirement applies only to personnel with administrative access and only for non-console access to the CDE. It does not apply to application or system accounts performing automated functions. If the entity does not use segmentation to separate the CDE from the rest of their network, an administrator could use multi-factor authentication either when logging onto the CDE network or when logging onto a system. If the CDE is segmented from the rest of the entity's network, an administrator would need to use multi-factor authentication when connecting to a CDE system from a non-CDE network. Multi-factor authentication can be implemented at network level or at system application level. It does not have to be both. If the administrator uses MFA when logging into the CDE network, they do not also need to use MFA to log into a particular system or application within the CDE. This requirement is intended to apply to all personnel, including general users, administrators, and vendors, for support or maintenance, with remote access to the network, where that remote access could lead to access to the CDE. If remote access is to an entity's network that has appropriate segmentation, such that remote users cannot access or impact the cardholder data environment, multi-factor authentication for remote access to that network would not be required. However, multi-factor authentication is required for any remote access to networks with access to the cardholder data environment and is recommended for all remote access to the entity's networks. Communicating password authentication policies and procedures to all users helps those users understand and abide by the policies. For example, guidance on selecting strong passwords may include suggestions to help personnel select hard-to-guess passwords that don't contain dictionary words and that don't contain information about the user, such as the user ID, names of family members, date of birth, etc. Guidance for protecting authentication credentials may include not writing down passwords or saving them in insecure files, and being alert for malicious individuals who may attempt to exploit their passwords, for example, by calling an employee and asking for their password so the caller can troubleshoot a problem. Instructing users to change passwords if there is a chance the password is no longer secure can prevent malicious users from using a legitimate password to gain unauthorized access. If multiple users share the same authentication credentials, for example, user account and password, it becomes impossible to trace system access and activities to an individual. This in turn prevents an entity from assigning accountability for, or having effective logging of, an individual's actions, since a given action could have been performed by anyone in the group that has knowledge of the authentication credentials. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. To prevent the compromise of multiple customers through the use of a single set of credentials, vendors with remote access accounts to customer environments should use a different authentication credential for each customer. Technologies, such as multi-factor mechanisms that provide a unique credential for each connection, for example, via a single-use password, could also meet the intent of this requirement. If user authentication mechanisms such as tokens, smart cards, and certificates can be used by multiple accounts, it may be impossible to identify the individual using the authentication mechanism. Having physical and/or logical controls, for example, a PIN, biometric data, or a password, to uniquely identify the user of the account will prevent unauthorized users from gaining access through use of a shared authentication mechanism. Without user authentication for access to databases and applications, the potential for unauthorized or malicious access increases, and such access cannot be logged since the user has not been authenticated and is therefore not known to the system. Also, database access should be granted through programmatic methods only, for example, through stored procedures, rather than via direct access to the database by end users, except for DBAs, who may need direct access to the database for their administrative duties. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures for managing identification and authorization on a continuous basis. Requirement 9. Restrict physical access to cardholder data. Any physical access to data or systems that house cardholder data provides the opportunity for individuals to access devices or data and to remove systems or hard copies, and should be appropriately restricted. For the purposes of Requirement 9, on-site personnel refers to full-time and part-time employees, temporary employees, contractors, and consultants who are physically present on the entity's premises. A visitor refers to a vendor, guest of any on-site personnel, service workers, or anyone who needs to enter the facility for a short duration, usually not more than 1 day. Media refers to all paper and electronic media containing cardholder data. Without physical access controls, such as badge systems and door controls, unauthorized persons could potentially gain access to the facility to steal, disable, disrupt, or destroy critical systems and cardholder data. Locking console login screens prevents unauthorized persons from gaining access to sensitive information, altering system configurations, introducing vulnerabilities into the network, or destroying records. When investigating physical breaches, these controls can help identify the individuals that physically accessed the sensitive areas, as well as when they entered and exited. Criminals attempting to gain physical access to sensitive areas will often attempt to disable or bypass the monitoring controls. To protect these controls from tampering, video cameras could be positioned so they are out of reach and/or be monitored to detect tampering. Similarly, access control mechanisms could be monitored or have physical protections installed to prevent them being damaged or disabled by malicious individuals. Examples of sensitive areas include corporate database server rooms, back-office rooms at retail locations that store cardholder data, and storage areas for large quantities of cardholder data. Sensitive areas should be identified by each organization to ensure the appropriate physical monitoring controls are implemented. Restricting access to network jacks, or network ports, will prevent malicious individuals from plugging into readily available network jacks and gain access into internal network resources. Whether logical or physical controls, or a combination of both, are used, they should be sufficient to prevent an individual or device that is not explicitly authorized from being able to connect to the network. Without security over access to wireless components and devices, malicious users could use an organization's unattended wireless devices to access network resources, or even connect their own devices to the wireless network to gain unauthorized access. Additionally, securing networking and communications hardware prevents malicious users from intercepting network traffic or physically connecting their own devices to wired network resources. Identifying authorized visitors so they are easily distinguished from on-site personnel prevents unauthorized visitors from being granted access to areas containing cardholder data. Controlling physical access to sensitive areas helps ensure that only authorized personnel with a legitimate business need are granted access. When personnel leave the organization, all physical access mechanisms should be returned or disabled promptly, as soon as possible, upon their departure, to ensure personnel cannot gain physical access to sensitive areas once their employment has ended. Visitor controls are important to reduce the ability of unauthorized and malicious persons to gain access to facilities and potentially to cardholder data. Visitor controls ensure visitors are identifiable as visitors so personnel can monitor their activities, and that their access is restricted to just the duration of their legitimate visit. Ensuring that visitor badges are returned upon expiry or completion of the visit prevents malicious persons from using a previously authorized pass to gain physical access into the building after the visit has ended. A visitor log documenting minimum information on the visitor is easy and inexpensive to maintain and will assist in identifying physical access to a building or room and potential access to cardholder data. Controls for physically securing media are intended to prevent unauthorized persons from gaining access to cardholder data on any type of media. Cardholder data is susceptible to unauthorized viewing, copying, or scanning if it is unprotected while it is on removable or portable media, printed out, or left on someone's desk. If stored in a non-secured facility, backups that contain cardholder data may easily be lost, stolen, or copied for malicious intent. Periodically reviewing the storage facility enables the organization to address identified security issues in a timely manner, minimizing the potential risk. Procedures and processes help protect cardholder data on media distributed to internal and/or external users. Without such procedures, data can be lost or stolen and used for fraudulent purposes. It is important that media be identified such that its classification status can be easily discernible. Media not identified as confidential may not be adequately protected or may be lost or stolen. Note, this does not mean the media needs to have a confidential label attached. The intent is that the organization has identified media that contains sensitive data so it can protect it. Media may be lost or stolen if sent via a non-trackable method such as regular postal mail. Use of secure couriers to deliver any media that contains cardholder data allows organizations to use their tracking systems to maintain inventory and location of shipments. Without a firm process for ensuring that all media movements are approved before the media is removed from secure areas, the media would not be tracked or appropriately protected, and its location would be unknown, leading to lost or stolen media. Without careful inventory methods and storage controls, stolen or missing media could go unnoticed for an indefinite amount of time. If media is not inventoried, stolen or lost media may not be noticed for a long time or at all. If steps are not taken to destroy information contained on hard disks, portable drives, CD/DVDs, or paper prior to disposal, malicious individuals may be able to retrieve information from the disposed media, leading to a data compromise. For example, malicious individuals may use a technique known as dumpster diving, where they search through trash cans and recycle bins looking for information they can use to launch an attack. Securing storage containers used for materials that are going to be destroyed prevents sensitive information from being captured while the materials are being collected. For example, to-be-shredded containers could have a lock preventing access to its contents or physic allied prevent access to the inside of the container. Examples of methods for securely destroying electronic media include secure wiping, degaussing, or physical destruction, such as grinding or shredding hard disks. Criminals attempt to steal cardholder data by stealing and/or manipulating card reading devices and terminals. For example, they will try to steal devices so they can learn how to break into them, and they often try to replace legitimate devices with fraudulent devices that send them payment card information every time a card is entered. Criminals will also try to add skimming components to the outside of devices, which are designed to capture payment card details before they even enter the device, for example, by attaching an additional card reader on top of the legitimate card reader so that the payment card details are captured twice, once by the criminal's component and then by the device's legitimate component. In this way, transactions may still be completed without interruption while the criminal is skimming the payment card information during the process. This requirement is recommended, but not required, for manual key entry components such as computer keyboards and POS keypads. Additional best practices on skimming prevention are available on the PCI DSS website. Keeping an up-to-date list of devices helps an organization keep track of where devices are supposed to be and quickly identify if a device is missing or lost. The method for maintaining a list of devices may be automated, for example, a device management system, or manual, for example, documented in electronic or paper records. For on-the-road devices, the location may include the name of the personnel to whom the device is assigned. Regular inspections of devices will help organizations to more quickly detect tampering or replacement of a device, and thereby minimize the potential impact of using fraudulent devices. The type of inspection will depend on the device. For example, photographs of devices that are known to be secure can be used to compare a device's current appearance with its original appearance to see whether it has changed. Another option may be to use a secure marker pen, such as a UV light marker, to mark device surfaces and device openings so any tampering or replacement will be apparent. Criminals will often replace the outer casing of a device to hide their tampering, and these methods may help to detect such activities. Device vendors may also be able to provide security guidance and how-to guides to help determine whether the device has been tampered with. The frequency of inspections will depend on factors such as location of device and whether the device is attended or unattended. For example, devices left in public areas without supervision by the organization's personnel may have more frequent inspections than devices that are kept in secure areas or are supervised when they are accessible to the public. The type and frequency of inspections is determined by the merchant, as defined by their annual risk assessment process. Criminals will often pose as authorized maintenance personnel in order to gain access to POS devices. All third parties requesting access to devices should always be verified before being provided access, for example, by checking with management or phoning the POS maintenance company, such as the vendor or acquirer, for verification. Many criminals will try to fool personnel by dressing for the part, for example, carrying toolboxes and dressed in work wear, and could also be knowledgeable about locations of devices. So it's important personnel are trained to follow procedures at all times. Another trick criminals like to use is to send a new POS system with instructions for swapping it with a legitimate system and returning the legitimate system to a specified address. The criminals may even provide return postage as they are very keen to get their hands on these devices. Personnel always verify with their manager or supplier that the device is legitimate and came from a trusted source before installing it or using it for business. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures for restricting physical access to cardholder data and CDE systems on a continuous basis. Requirement 10. Track and monitor all access to network resources and cardholder data. Logging mechanisms and the ability to track user activities are critical in preventing, detecting, or minimizing the impact of a data compromise. The presence of logs in all environments allows thorough tracking, alerting, and analysis when something does go wrong. Determining the cause of a compromise is very difficult, if not impossible, without system activity logs. It is critical to have a process or system that links user access to system components accessed. This system generates audit logs and provides the ability to trace back suspicious activity to a specific user. Generating audit trails of suspect activities alerts the system administrator, sends data to other monitoring mechanisms, like intrusion detection systems, and provides a history trail for post-incident follow-up. Logging of the following events enables an organization to identify and trace potentially malicious activities. Malicious individuals could obtain knowledge of a user account with access to systems in the CDE, or they could create a new, unauthorized account in order to access cardholder data. A record of all individual accesses to cardholder data can identify which accounts may have been compromised or misused. Accounts with increased privileges, such as the administrator or root account, have the potential to greatly impact the security or operational functionality of a system. Without a log of the activities performed, an organization is unable to trace any issues resulting from an administrative mistake or misuse of privilege back to the specific action and individual. Malicious users often attempt to alter audit logs to hide their actions, and a record of access allows an organization to trace any inconsistencies or potential tampering of the logs to an individual account. Having access to logs identifying changes, additions, and deletions can help retrace steps made by unauthorized personnel. Malicious individuals will often perform multiple access attempts on targeted systems. Multiple invalid login attempts may be an indication of an unauthorized user's attempts to brute force or guess a password. Without knowing who was logged on at the time of an incident, it is impossible to identify the accounts that may have been used. Additionally, malicious users may attempt to manipulate the authentication controls with the intent of bypassing them or impersonating a valid account. Turning the audit logs off, or pausing them, prior to performing illicit activities is a common practice for malicious users wishing to avoid detection. Initialization of audit logs could indicate that the log function was disabled by a user to hide their actions. Malicious software, such as malware, often creates or replaces system-level objects on the target system in order to control a particular function or operation on that system. By logging when system-level objects, such as database tables or stored procedures, are created or deleted, it will be easier to determine whether such modifications were authorized. By recording these details for the auditable events at 10. 2. A potential compromise can be quickly identified, and with sufficient detail to know who, what, where, when, and how. Time synchronization technology is used to synchronize clocks on multiple systems. When clocks are not properly synchronized, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to compare log files from different systems and establish an exact sequence of events, crucial for forensic analysis in the event of a breach. For post-incident forensics teams, the accuracy and consistency of time across all systems and the time of each activity is critical in determining how the systems were compromised. Often a malicious individual who has entered the network will attempt to edit the audit logs in order to hide their activity. Without adequate protection of audit logs, their completeness, accuracy, and integrity cannot be guaranteed, and the audit logs can be rendered useless as an investigation tool after a compromise. Adequate protection of the audit logs includes strong access control, limit access to logs based on need to know only, and use of physical or network segregation to make the logs harder to find and modify. Promptly backing up the logs to a centralized log server or media that is difficult to alter keeps the logs protected even if the system generating the logs becomes compromised. By writing logs from external-facing technologies such as wireless, firewalls, DNS, and mail servers, the risk of those logs being lost or altered is lowered, as they are more secure within the internal network. Logs may be written directly, or offloaded or copied from external systems, to the secure internal system or media. File integrity monitoring or change detection systems check for changes to critical files, and notify when such changes are noted. For file integrity monitoring purposes, an entity usually monitors files that don't regularly change, but when changed indicate a possible compromise. Many breaches occur over days or months before being detected. Regular log reviews by personnel or automated means can identify and proactively address unauthorized access to the cardholder data environment. The log review process does not have to be manual. The use of log harvesting, parsing, and alerting tools can help facilitate the process by identifying log events that need to be reviewed. Checking logs daily minimizes the amount of time and exposure of a potential breach. Daily review of security events, for example, notifications or alerts that identify suspicious or anomalous activities, as well as logs from critical system components, and logs from systems that perform security functions, such as firewalls, IDS/IPS, file integrity monitoring, FIM, systems, etc., is necessary to identify potential issues. Note that the determination of security event will vary for each organization and may include consideration for the type of technology, location, and function of the device. Organizations may also wish to maintain a baseline of normal traffic to help identify anomalous behavior. Logs for all other system components should also be periodically reviewed to identify indications of potential issues or attempts to gain access to sensitive systems via less sensitive systems. The frequency of the reviews should be determined by an entity's annual risk assessment. If exceptions and anomalies identified during the log review process are not investigated, the entity may be unaware of unauthorized and potentially malicious activities that are occurring within their own network. Retaining logs for at least a year allows for the fact that it often takes a while to notice that a compromise has occurred or is occurring, and allows investigators sufficient log history to better determine the length of time of a potential breach and potential systems impacted. By having 3 months of logs immediately available, an entity can quickly identify and minimize impact of a data breach. Storing logs in offline locations could prevent them from being readily available, resulting in longer time frames to restore log data, perform analysis, and identify impacted systems or data. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. Without formal processes to detect and alert when critical security controls fail, failures may go undetected for extended periods and provide attackers ample time to compromise systems and steal sensitive data from the cardholder data environment. The specific types of failures may vary depending on the function of the device and technology in use. Typical failures include a system ceasing to perform its security function or not functioning in its intended manner, for example, a firewall erasing all its rules or going offline. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. If critical security control failures alerts are not quickly and effectively responded to, attackers may use this time to insert malicious software, gain control of a system, or steal data from the entity's environment. Documented evidence, e.g., records within a problem management system, should support that processes and procedures are in place to respond to security failures. In addition, personnel should be aware of their responsibilities in the event of a failure. Actions and responses to the failure should be captured in the documented evidence. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and daily operational procedures for monitoring all access to network resources and cardholder data on a continuous basis. Requirement 11. Regularly test security systems and processes. Vulnerabilities are being discovered continually by malicious individuals and researchers and being introduced by new software. System components, processes, and custom software should be tested frequently to ensure security controls continue to reflect a changing environment. Implementation and/or exploitation of wireless technology within a network are some of the most common paths for malicious users to gain access to the network and cardholder data. If a wireless device or network is installed without a company's knowledge, it can allow an attacker to easily and invisibly enter the network. Unauthorized wireless devices may be hidden within or attached to a computer or other system component, or be attached directly to a network port or network device, such as a switch or router. Any such unauthorized device could result in an unauthorized access point into the environment. Knowing which wireless devices are authorized can help administrators quickly identify non-authorized wireless devices, and responding to the identification of unauthorized wireless access points helps to proactively minimize the exposure of CDE to malicious individuals. Due to the ease with which a wireless access point can be attached to a network, the difficulty in detecting their presence, and the increased risk presented by unauthorized wireless devices, these processes must be performed even when a policy exists prohibiting the use of wireless technology. The size and complexity of a particular environment will dictate the appropriate tools and processes to be used to provide sufficient assurance that a rogue wireless access point has not been installed in the environment. For example, in the case of a single standalone retail kiosk in a shopping mall, where all communication components are contained within tamper-resistant and tamper-evident casings, performing a detailed physical inspection of the kiosk itself may be sufficient to provide assurance that a rogue wireless access point has not been attached or installed. However, in an environment with multiple nodes, such as in a large retail store, call center, server room, or data center, detailed physical inspection is difficult. In this case, multiple methods may be combined to meet the requirement, such as performing physical system inspections in conjunction with the results of a wireless analyzer. A vulnerability scan is a combination of automated or manual tools, techniques, and/or methods run against external and internal network devices and servers, designed to expose potential vulnerabilities that could be found and exploited by malicious individuals. There are 3 types of vulnerability scanning required for PCI DSS. Internal quarterly vulnerability scanning by qualified personnel, use of a PCI SSC approved scanning vendor, ASV, is not required. External quarterly vulnerability scanning, which must be performed by an ASV. Internal and external scanning as needed after significant changes. Once these weaknesses are identified, the entity corrects them and repeats the scan until all vulnerabilities have been corrected. Identifying and addressing vulnerabilities in a timely manner reduces the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited and potential compromise of a system component or cardholder data. An established process for identifying vulnerabilities on internal systems requires that vulnerability scans be conducted quarterly. Vulnerabilities posing the greatest risk to the environment, for example, ranked high per requirement 6.1, should be resolved with the highest priority. Internal vulnerability scans can be performed by qualified, internal staff that are reasonably independent of the system components being scanned. For example, a firewall administrator should not be responsible for scanning the firewall, or an entity may choose to have internal vulnerability scans performed by a firm specializing in vulnerability scanning. As external networks are at greater risk of compromise, quarterly external vulnerability scanning must be performed by a PCI SSC approved scanning vendor, ASV. A robust scanning program ensures that scans are performed and vulnerabilities addressed in a timely manner. The determination of what constitutes a significant change is highly dependent on the configuration of a given environment. If an upgrade or modification could allow access to cardholder data or affect the security of the cardholder data environment, then it could be considered significant. Scanning an environment after any significant changes are made ensures that changes were completed appropriately such that the security of the environment was not compromised as a result of the change. All system components affected by the change will need to be scanned. The intent of a penetration test is to simulate a real-world attack situation with a goal of identifying how far an attacker would be able to penetrate into an environment. This allows an entity to gain a better understanding of their potential exposure and develop a strategy to defend against attacks. A penetration test differs from a vulnerability scan, as a penetration test is an active process that may include exploiting identified vulnerabilities. Conducting a vulnerability scan may be one of the first steps a penetration tester will perform in order to plan the testing strategy, although it is not the only step. Even if a vulnerability scan does not detect known vulnerabilities, the penetration tester will often gain enough knowledge about the system to identify possible security gaps. Penetration testing is generally a highly manual process. While some automated tools may be used, the tester uses their knowledge of systems to penetrate into an environment. Often the tester will chain several types of exploits together with a goal of breaking through layers of defenses. For example, if the tester finds a means to gain access to an application server, they will then use the compromised server as a point to stage a new attack based on the resources the server has access to. In this way, a tester is able to simulate the methods performed by an attacker to identify areas of potential weakness in the environment. Penetration testing techniques will be different for different organizations, and the type, depth, and complexity of the testing will depend on the specific environment and the organization's risk assessment. Penetration testing conducted on a regular basis and after significant changes to the environment is a proactive security measure that helps minimize potential access to the CDE by malicious individuals. The determination of what constitutes a significant upgrade or modification is highly dependent on the configuration of a given environment. If an upgrade or modification could allow access to cardholder data or affect the security of the cardholder data environment, then it could be considered significant. Performing penetration tests after network upgrades and modifications provides assurance that the controls assumed to be in place are still working effectively after the upgrade or modification. Penetration testing is an important tool to confirm that any segmentation in place to isolate the CDE from other networks is effective. The penetration testing should focus on the segmentation controls, both from outside the entity's network and from inside the network, but outside of the CDE, to confirm that they are not able to get through the segmentation controls to access the CDE. For example, network testing and/or scanning for open ports to verify no connectivity between in-scope and out-of-scope networks. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. For service providers, validation of PCI DSS scope should be performed as frequently as possible to ensure PCI DSS scope remains up to date and aligned with changing business objectives. Intrusion detection and/or intrusion prevention techniques, such as IDS/IPS, compare the traffic coming into the network with known signatures and/or behaviors of thousands of compromised types, hacker tools, trojans, and other malware, and send alerts and/or stop the attempt as it happens. Without a proactive approach to unauthorized activity detection, attacks on, or misuse of, computer resources could go unnoticed in real time. Security alerts generated by these techniques should be monitored so that the attempted intrusions can be stopped. Change detection solutions such as file integrity monitoring, FIM, tools check for changes, additions, and deletions to critical files, and notify when such changes are detected. If not implemented properly and the output of the change detection solution monitored, a malicious individual could add, remove, or alter configuration file contents, operating system programs, or application executables. Unauthorized changes, if undetected, could render existing security controls ineffective and/or result in cardholder data being stolen with no perceptible impact to normal processing. Personnel need to be aware of and following security policies and operational procedures for security monitoring and testing on a continuous basis. Requirement 12. Maintain a policy that addresses information security for all personnel. A strong security policy sets the security tone for the whole entity and informs personnel what is expected of them. All personnel should be aware of the sensitivity of data and their responsibilities for protecting it. For the purposes of Requirement 12, personnel refers to full-time and part-time employees, temporary employees, contractors, and consultants who are resident on the entity's site or otherwise have access to the cardholder data environment. A company's information security policy creates the roadmap for implementing security measures to protect its most valuable assets. All personnel should be aware of the sensitivity of data and their responsibilities for protecting it. Security threats and protection methods evolve rapidly. Without updating the security policy to reflect relevant changes, new protection measures to fight against these threats are not addressed. A risk assessment enables an organization to identify threats and associated vulnerabilities with the potential to negatively impact their business. Examples of different risk considerations include cybercrime, web attacks, and POS malware. Resources can then be effectively allocated to implement controls that reduce the likelihood and/or the potential impact of the threat being realized. Performing risk assessments at least annually and upon significant changes allows the organization to keep up to date with organizational changes and evolving threats, trends, and technologies. Personnel usage policies can either prohibit use of certain devices and other technologies if that is company policy, or provide guidance for personnel as to correct usage and implementation. If usage policies are not in place, personnel may use the technologies in violation of company policy, thereby allowing malicious individuals to gain access to critical systems and cardholder data. Without requiring proper approval for implementation of these technologies, individual personnel may innocently implement a solution to a perceived business need, but also open a huge hole that subjects critical systems and data to malicious individuals. If technology is implemented without proper authentication, user IDs and passwords, tokens, VPNs, etc., malicious individuals may easily use this unprotected technology to access critical systems and cardholder data. Malicious individuals may breach physical security and place their own devices on the network as a backdoor. Personnel may also bypass procedures and install devices. An accurate inventory with proper device labeling allows for quick identification of non-approved installations. Malicious individuals may breach physical security and place their own devices on the network as a backdoor. Personnel may also bypass procedures and install devices. An accurate inventory with proper device labeling allows for quick identification of non-approved installations. Consider establishing an official naming convention for devices and log all devices with established inventory controls. Logical labeling may be employed with information such as codes that can correlate the device to its owner, contact information, and purpose. By defining acceptable business use and location of company-approved devices and technology, the company is better able to manage and control gaps in configurations and operational controls, to ensure a backdoor is not opened for a malicious individual to gain access to critical systems and cardholder data. Remote access technologies are frequent backdoors to critical resources and cardholder data. By disconnecting remote access technologies when not in use, for example, those used to support your systems by your POS vendor, other vendors, or business partners, access and risk to networks is minimized. To ensure all personnel are aware of their responsibilities to not store or copy cardholder data onto their local personal computers or other media, your policy should clearly prohibit such activities except for personnel that have been explicitly authorized to do so. Storing or copying cardholder data onto a local hard drive or other media must be in accordance with all applicable PCI DSS requirements. Without clearly defined security roles and responsibilities assigned, there could be inconsistent interaction with the security group, leading to unsecured implementation of technologies or use of outdated or unsecured technologies. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. Executive management assignment of PCI DSS compliance responsibilities ensures executive-level visibility into the PCI DSS compliance program and allows for the opportunity to ask appropriate questions, to determine the effectiveness of the program and influence strategic priorities. Overall responsibility for the PCI DSS compliance program may be assigned to individual roles and/or to business units within the organization. Executive management may include C-level positions, board of directors, or equivalent. The specific titles will depend on the particular organizational structure. The level of detail provided to executive management should be appropriate for the particular organization and the intended audience. Each person or team with responsibilities for information security management should be clearly aware of their responsibilities and related tasks through specific policy. Without this accountability, gaps in processes may open access into critical resources or cardholder data. Entities should also consider transition and/or succession plans for key personnel to avoid potential gaps in security assignments, which could result in responsibilities not being assigned and therefore not performed. If personnel are not educated about their security responsibilities, security safeguards and processes that have been implemented may become ineffective through errors or intentional actions. If the security awareness program does not include periodic refresher sessions, key security processes and procedures may be forgotten or bypassed, resulting in exposed critical resources and cardholder data. Requiring an acknowledgement by personnel in writing or electronically helps ensure that they have read and understood the security policies procedures, and that they have made and will continue to make a commitment to comply with these policies. Performing thorough background investigations prior to hiring potential personnel who are expected to be given access to cardholder data reduces the risk of unauthorized use of PANs and other cardholder data by individuals with questionable or criminal backgrounds. If a merchant or service provider shares cardholder data with a service provider, certain requirements apply to ensure continued protection of this data will be enforced by such service providers. Some examples of the different types of service providers include backup tape storage facilities, managed service providers such as web hosting companies or security service providers, entities that receive data for fraud modeling purposes, etc. Keeping track of all service providers identifies where potential risk extends to outside of the organization. The acknowledgement of the service providers evidences their commitment to maintaining proper security of cardholder data that it obtains from its clients. The extent to which the service provider is responsible for the security of cardholder data will depend on the particular service and the agreement between the provider and assessed entity. In conjunction with Requirement 12.9, this requirement is intended to promote a consistent level of understanding between parties about their applicable PCI DSS responsibilities. For example, the agreement may include the applicable PCI DSS requirements to be maintained as part of the provided service. The process ensures that any engagement of a service provider is thoroughly vetted internally by an organization, which should include a risk analysis prior to establishing a formal relationship with the service provider. Specific due diligence processes and goals will vary for each organization. Examples of considerations may include the provider's reporting practices, breach notification and incident response procedures, details of how PCI DSS responsibilities are assigned between each party, how the provider validates their PCI DSS compliance and what evidence they will provide, etc. Knowing your service provider's PCI DSS compliance status provides assurance and awareness about whether they comply with the same requirements that your organization is subject to. If the service provider offers a variety of services, this requirement should apply to those services delivered to the client and those services in scope for the client's PCI DSS assessment. The specific information an entity maintains will depend on the particular agreement with their providers, the type of service, etc. The intent is for the assessed entity to understand which PCI DSS requirements their providers have agreed to meet. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. In conjunction with Requirement 12.8.2, this requirement is intended to promote a consistent level of understanding between service providers and their customers about their applicable PCI DSS responsibilities. The acknowledgement of the service providers evidences their commitment to maintaining proper security of cardholder data that it obtains from its clients. The service provider's internal policies and procedures related to their customer engagement process and any templates used for written agreements should include provision of an applicable PCI DSS acknowledgement to their customers. The method by which the service provider provides written acknowledgement should be agreed between the provider and their customers. Without a thorough security incident response plan that is properly disseminated, read, and understood by the parties responsible, confusion and lack of a unified response could create further downtime for the business, unnecessary public media exposure, as well as new legal liabilities. The incident response plan should be thorough and contain all the key elements to allow your company to respond effectively in the event of a breach that could impact cardholder data. Without proper testing, key steps may be missed, which could result in increased exposure during an incident. Without a trained and readily available incident response team, extended damage to the network could occur, and critical data and systems may become polluted by inappropriate handling of the targeted systems. This can hinder the success of a post-incident investigation. These monitoring systems are designed to focus on potential risk to data, are critical in taking quick action to prevent a breach, and must be included in the incident response processes. Incorporating lessons learned into the incident response plan after an incident helps keep the plan current and able to react to emerging threats and security trends. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. Regularly confirming that security policies and procedures are being followed provides assurance that the expected controls are active and working as intended. The objective of these reviews is not to reperform other PCI DSS requirements, but to confirm whether procedures are being followed as expected. Note, this requirement applies only when the entity being assessed is a service provider. The intent of these independent checks is to confirm whether security activities are being performed on an ongoing basis. These reviews can also be used to verify that appropriate evidence is being maintained, for example, audit logs, vulnerability scan reports, firewall reviews, etc., to assist the entity's preparation for its next PCI DSS assessment.